So grateful that you're here. My name's Reverend Will McGarvey, and this is Tahil Sharma with the United Religions Initiative. He's our new Northern American. What's your real title, Tahil,
Regional coordinator.
for North America?
That's right.
They've got the globe divvied up with all sorts of different groups that do a lot of work together, and Tahil's our new representative, and we're glad to be able to have a conversation with you, even just online during this season of caring for COVID-19. And we had a conversation last week
Mhm.
and talked about how we can work together as an interfaith council, which is the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County is a cooperation circle of the United Religions Initiative. If you want to look more about their website, it's uri.org, and they have cooperation. How many cooperation circles around the world now?
As of right now, we're at around 90 cooperation circles.
In like 108 or 109 countries. So
Oh, in,
all
in,
of
in countries around the world, we have 1,050 actually,
1,050 cooperation circles
around
in,
in 108 countries.
wow, nice.
Hmm.
So Interfaith Contra Costa County is one of those cooperation circles.
Hmm.
But tell us a little bit about you, Tahil, so we can get to know you since we'll be working with you for the next few years.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. I am a native from Southern California, speaking to you from Claremont right now. I was born to a dual religious family. My father's family is Hindu and my mother's family is Sikh. And I accept and follow both traditions, more on the philosophical and theological ends rather than the dogmatic ones. And both of my religions have informed me to serve as many other communities that are marginally oppressed as possible, which is why for the past 7 years I've been doing interfaith work through the capacity of social justice work and advocacy. Um, I've worked with a number of different interfaith organizations regionally and internationally. Um, Also doing work with the UN, also doing work with the State Department, and finally in this capacity as your regional coordinator for North America with URI. And it's been nothing but an adventure for these past 7 years, getting to see what interfaith cooperation looks like in its many definitions, but also acknowledging the power of bringing people together from different backgrounds and worldviews to be able to really make the world a better place.
Wow, what a history! What have you done with the State Department and the UN?
Sure. In 2016, I was the Stevens Initiative coordinator for an organization called AMP Global Youth. We worked with the Eurasia Foundation with funding from the State Department and a couple of other places through the Aspen Institute to put together a mobile game app where we would be having a virtual exchange between students in the US and the Middle East, particularly from Iran. And the students would be communicating with each other through this game on doing collaborative uh, games of answering questions and doing tasks and stuff like that to get through different levels of the game. And they had to first focus on using symbols rather than language itself so that they could communicate with one another and learn how to cooperate and then begin to talk to each other and get to know one another.
So it didn't automatically translate for them between Farsi and English?
No, not immediately because there were
Oh,
numerous
amazing.
iterations and versions. Yeah. And it started off completely with visuals and just using arrows and circles and X's to try to get, answers right. And then later outside of the game, we would have like genuine communication between English and Farsi.
Wow,
Mhm. And
amazing.
before that, I actually served as the one of the youth representatives to the United Nations for the Parliament of the World's Religions, and got to present at one of their NGO conferences at the headquarters in New York. And I also worked a couple of months with Religions for Peace International, first as an intern and then as one of their communications consultants for a couple of months. So I was there during their Faiths for Earth campaign, where they got hundreds of thousands of people to sign a petition for sustainable development and environmental justice. And I was also there during the, I want to say, the 2015 General Assembly at the UN. So I was there during a very popping time, as one would put it, where the world's leaders were coming together and we were able to meet major diplomats and religious leaders from all over the world.
That's amazing. I've been to the last two parliaments of the
Mm.
world's religions in Salt Lake City and Toronto.
Same, same.
And the Religions for Peace is an amazing group. I saw one of their interfaith peace prayer times for the cessation of violence and armed conflict during this season of caring for COVID-19.
Mm. Absolutely. And it speaks to, this the sense of the three major organizations that are doing this global interfaith work. Religions for Peace, that really does it through the top-down process of working with religious leaders and diplomats. URI, that does it very much through the grassroots. And
Hmm.
then the parliament being the gathering space for everyone that is involved in it.
That's right. Yeah, I've done a couple presentations there too. That's always fun.
Yep,
And you never know what you're going to get and who's going to show up, and it's always interesting that way too.
definitely.
Yeah. So, what's your favorite part of interfaith work?
Ooh. um,
Just a little question.
Yeah, just a little question. If I wanted to be more superficial, it would be the food.
The food is always good.
The food's always
I
good.
take advantage of that myself too much.
Yeah. Getting to try, what we sometimes actually don't think about is the cultural diversity that comes with religious diversity, and how it
Yeah.
gives us this new appreciation for our palate when trying to build relationships with different communities. Getting to try all sorts of different cuisines and home foods, and um, there's never going wrong with a good plate of food, and that's probably one of the best ways to do peace building with others is by breaking bread with them. Um, I think more intrinsically and focusing on my heart and my mind, it's definitely um, being able to recognize that the pursuit of justice is what creates peace. And in pursuing justice, you have to acknowledge the inclusion and intersection of so many different communities, and getting to know them and work with them to help fight for healthcare, to help fight for affordable housing, to help fight for um, the ability to live in your own skin with comfort and safety, um, is something that I could never be more thankful for, especially during times when the moral urgency of all of this is being reflected by this pandemic itself.
That's right.
Racism and xenophobia, socioeconomic status, all of the things that we thought were going to be sidelined are now heightened because of this pandemic. And acknowledging that in a religious and interreligious context for me means advocating and doing what we can while being mindful how interconnected we are, and how our physical isolation does not prevent us from still pursuing justice.
So true. And especially just recognizing that sometimes the needs of different faith communities and cultural groups are at odds with one another,
Right.
especially in an increasingly um, uh, a world where there's increasingly scarce water resources.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So the other big regional interfaith group in this area is the North American Interfaith Network, NAIN.
Mm-hmm.
We've had friends go to some of their conferences and report back, but very few of our folks have much experience with NAIN. Do you have any experience with them?
Yes, in 2017, I participated in their NAIN Connect in San Diego. I was selected as one of their young adult scholars, so I spoke on a panel with several colleagues at UC San Diego, and that was one of the ways of getting to know a lot of the folks that are involved in interfaith now, more in the context of California particularly, but also connecting with folks in Canada and Mexico who had been really a part of this tradition of doing work through NAIN, that helped me build a new context of what interfaith looks like outside of the United States. It was thanks
Mm.
to Nain that I actually got to travel to Mexico to go to an interfaith conference there. I thankfully am able to speak Spanish pretty fluently, and to participate in something interfaith outside of the American context was mind-boggling, to say the least.
Mm. And
Because
outside
of
of the
their
English context.
Yes, exactly. Outside of the English Anglo context as well, um, the emphasis on the indigenous, the emphasis on
Mm.
understanding religious fluidity as being, welcomed rather than being pushed away, and the ability to really acknowledge holistic methods of trying to support the entire well-being of a person was a big aspect of the conference. So getting to see that and see people from Argentina to Brazil to Colombia to Honduras to Panama all gathering in Guadalajara, and being Hindu, being Sikh, being Muslim, being Christian, being atheist, and sharing their common concerns and experiences, while I, as the American coming from an Indian dual religious background who knows Spanish, enters the space, and we all sort of confuse each other or psych each other out.
So, say more about the dual religious identity and the fluidity you mentioned about learning about in this conference.
Definitely. My dual religious identity is something that you know I'm still developing. I have not figured out my life yet. If I find someone that has, I'd love to talk to them. But in terms of my convictions religiously, I think I have centered myself so much more on service and justice in striving for peace that um, my understanding of both my traditions has always had an ebb and flow. Um, I've always questioned, I've always been skeptical, and somehow I end up getting a stronger faith by the end of the day. So I don't know if what I'm doing is right or not, but it's doing something. um, my practice in Sikhism, which has always been, service to God is service to mankind, is a really key principle that I really adhere to, which is something that Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, really honed in on. And from my Hindu side, which actually I have more struggle with, was the fact that there were so many things that were antithetical to this idea of pluralism and compassion and kindness to all creatures that were put into practice by my own family through the caste system or through people that I met who would misuse materialism as an attempt to be devotional, made me push away from their conservative attitudes and made me actually go into more of the feminine aspect of divinity in Hinduism that I really adhere to more. And getting to be in a space in Mexico where people shared those experiences in different traditions really, one, freaked me out because it was nice to not be the only person to finally talk about this. But two, it was also nice to see that there was an appreciation from crowds that I had assumptions about. My favorite example was there was a crowd of a couple hundred, born, baptized, confirmed Catholics who were watching this Hindu ceremony for the god Krishna. And they were doing what is called a Pushpanjali, which is where they offer flowers to be able to do devotion. All 300 of these Catholics decided to go participate in the Hindu prayer. And I had an internal crisis of what if a bishop sees this? I don't know what's going to happen. Are they all going to be excommunicated? And in talking to those people, they had a totally different attitude. They had such an appreciative attitude to the ritual of the divine that they said, what we're doing here for Krishna is what we would do for Jesus anyway. So it's not like we have to separate the two to be able to continue to show our devotion to the same God. And I was so taken aback because it's not, I didn't find it insulting. It just reminded me of sometimes what we see as the rigidness of being an observer versus a participant in someone else's tradition. And that really informed my way of understanding how religious fluidity and appreciation can be defined in different ways depending on the community that you're
So that last sentence you just said, I've been chewing on. Um, do you still have it?
in. The one that I just literally said.
Yeah,
Um, the difference of definition between being an observer and a participant.
that's it.
Yeah.
That's an interesting place to exist.
Mm-hmm. It is. It really is.
And when we get invited by folks to experience something of their own tradition that's sacred and special for them,
Mm-hmm.
and being invited into that moment as a person whose main religious experience is a different tradition
Mm-hmm.
can be mind blowing on a religious and a culturally and a linguistic basis
Mm-hmm.
to have this little glimpse into their world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the way language informs and sets boundaries and allows folks to be able to move into other movements of religious experience with music and scents, incense burning,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever chants or forms of meditation
Right.
uh, that are a part of that.
Definitely. Yeah.
That's just amazing.
It is. And I continue to carry that with me, I think, especially during the time of COVID-19, because this is a time for us to be able to hone in on that experience too, where people who don't think they can learn about the world's religions actually have the perfect opportunity to immerse themselves through digital spaces. And granted, it might be a little difficult in the sensory experience because you're not in the same room with the flowers and the incense and the music. There are ways to be able to channel that in changing one's observations into participation. And getting to grant that access to people in such a unique way now with things like Zoom or Skype is just mind blowing. We couldn't think of doing that years ago.
Well, and I think years ago, many of us in interfaith circles were still responding to the first pushback we were experiencing of interfaith, that some people felt threatened by interfaith because it felt like people were trying to conflate all of the religions into one, and there was it wasn't just religious exclusivists that had some of these views, but other folks that felt even being in the same room and allowing all of our religious expressions and prayers to exist in the same space either gave too much credence to others, or or some people really did just allow it to just go to the lowest common denominator that we all have in common, rather than celebrating the differences as well, right? And I think that's where interfaith has grown the most in the last decade, is um, not being afraid to be with each other, expecting diversity in prayers and thought, expecting diversity of religious theological approaches to different aspects of life,
Mm.
different parts of that wisdom to be expressed, and not only creating the container for it, but celebrating the diversity that comes out of that, rather than pushing that diversity aside and looking for what we have more in common with others, right?
Exactly. And there's a two-pronged approach to that point. One is acknowledging difference and not denying that people come from different experiences. And two, being able to realize that in having an appreciative knowledge of others is what will strengthen your convictions and views of the world. Those two go very much hand in hand for me because that's been such a deep part of my upbringing. Being able to have appreciative inquiry, being able to acknowledge that people's differences can still bring us to the same conclusions about how we're looking for a better world. And if I'm not willing to actually invest in learning about that difference in other people, then there's no reason for me to be involved in this movement whatsoever.
Well, some folks like to learn about the religious diversity of the other movements, and some folks, and maybe it's folks like us, and especially with the emphasis you have on justice
Hmm.
towards peacemaking, and that's very much an approach that I like to take as well. But I wonder if if just getting permission from books like Barbara Brown Taylor's Holy Envy
Mm,
gives us permission to be able to look at the practices and components of different world religions
hmm.
as the inheritance of all humanity, and allow us to be able to find that beauty that we see in another tradition,
Hmm.
and not just notice it and lift it up for others, but to allow it to say, what in my own tradition do I find either missing in my own practice of that tradition,
Hmm.
or what have I just not gone off to seek that answers these kinds of questions that we may have,
Right.
whether that's around suffering or whether it's around social justice or environmental issues, or
Hmm.
even just around what does it mean for indigenous people around the world to be reclaiming and reinstituting religious practices that have been lost for a generation or two, and as we're invited to be with Laplanders or Native Americans or other indigenous peoples from other parts of the world to experience what their cultures have that are probably most at risk in losing their language or the different practices of their traditions,
Hmm.
as as being able to not just celebrate that diversity that's reclaimed and preserved, but also to be able to find our own religious impulse within our own tradition, where we can go even deeper in our own tradition
Hmm.
and be reminded that we do have theological and cultural um, inheritances there, if only we would seek them out.
Right. Hmm.
How do you do that between your two religions of Hinduism and Sikhism? Because in some ways there's a lot of overlap, because especially Hinduism has um, many of their gurus were Hindu and many of them were Muslim,
Hmm.
and there's some similar cosmology there. But what do you do when parts of the two traditions that you embody either find a dissonant chord, or one's in the pentatonic scale and one's in a different musical scale altogether? What do you do when you rub up against those
I think in
issues?
using your metaphor of the two instruments, I gotta wait until it turns into a symphony, right? And there's gonna
Well,
be a
I don't
little
know. I mean, a piano is in the pentatonic scale,
right, right,
but
right,
but
right,
an
right.
oud is on a totally different scale. The same notes can be played on an oud, but there are additional notes on an oud that aren't on the piano,
True,
right?
true, true, true. Yeah, it's the what partly informs that resolution in me is that oftentimes the dissonance is more human than it is divine, because there aren't a lot of inherent things towards those two traditions that necessarily make them counter one another, at least in my interpretations of those two religions. It is more of the, you know, practice and the dogma in itself that can oftentimes be extremely different. The ritualism or the offerings or the languages being used or the baggages of those communities are often what make them seem like they might be counter to one another.
Or even the
Or
history of violence between the two communities, right?
precisely. And I fully acknowledge that violence as being at an intersection. I am a product of those two traditions, and in my own family, let alone in the larger narrative of sectarianism that's come out of India in the several decades. I know that they've run counter to each other, especially in 1984. Um,
Mm.
my father's side of the family was not quite friendly to my mother, And this was in the early part of 1984 when they got married. And then later that year, we had the pogroms against the Sikh community, where my mom's side of the family goes into hiding. My grandfather almost gets killed. And my father is the one that is defending the Sikh community against the mobs that are trying to attack them.
Mm.
And having that kind of very real world solidarity and pushback against tyranny in the way that it took place in India that year is also a big part of what informs me in the worldview that I have sort of jointly between those two traditions.
Yeah, there's an increasing number of folks that are. I don't think they're just being cafeteria about it. I think they're finding real spiritual practices in different traditions that really speak to who they are and help them live into their fullest humanity.
That's
And I'm seeing that multiple people have. I've met a few folks that have both a Christian and a pagan practice.
Mm-hmm.
The president of our council has both a Christian and a Buddhist practice.
Mm-hmm.
We have members of even some of our Jewish communities that also have Buddhist practices, and use Buddhist meditation, and some have even studied at Buddha Gate Monastery, which is another member of our council. So some have done a deeper dive in Taiwanese Buddhism and what that looks like for them as Americans. And so it's fascinating as people not only marry and create interfaith families, but even as individuals take on religious identities that include two or more faith traditions.
Right.
To know of the conflict and how that conflict has created those communities as separate entities.
Right.
But also recognizing how the spiritual practices are sometimes similar and sometimes different, and how those differences and distinctions make the difference for people is fascinating as well.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I think, is just we are this one big world where it's easier to meet one another now than it ever has been.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of those barriers that push people in one community to be very homogenous has gone away. And we're definitely in a time where, as people meet and fall in love and create families and create new traditions as interfaith families, or as people reclaim sometimes the spirituality of their ancestors, whether that's in the British Isles or parts of Africa and Yoruba, or reclaiming even some of the more ancient indigenous sects of Japan and East Asia. It's just so fascinating to learn what makes meaning for people.
Right. Right.
So Carolyn McKenzie, our president, has been doing some work with URI, especially this new initiative with Bishop Swing, the founder of URI, on ending the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit more about that and any other big programs that URI is working on, that folks that have specific topical things that they want to work on, and how they might be able to do that through some of the other cooperation circles?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, one of them is not the nuclear disarmament one, because I want to know more details about that, and I with quite some transparency can't say much about it.
I think it's so new. Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely want to inform myself about that too before I share anything. But there are a couple of things we're definitely working on. Our global environmental coordinator, Lauren Van Ham, who works at the Global Support Office,
She used to be at the Chaplaincy Institute, which is a member of our council.
Yes, and she continues to actually serve in some capacity to help share the message of the global URI community to the Chaplaincy Institute.
Nice.
She is looking to connect with as many CCs as possible as we continue to enter different phases of trying to fight the climate emergency, which we've seen, very, very slowly heal once we've all been grounded by Mother Nature. So she is looking for folks that are working on various projects on environmental sustainability and tying it into her work for World Environmental Day, for Earth Day next year, and for other initiatives that will be coming out, especially in relation to our work with the United Nations. There's definitely a need for trying to get more of a test of the young people that are being involved in different cooperation circles. Our global youth coordinator, Sarah Oliver, is someone that is looking to see what North America's makeup of young people involved in interfaith looks like, and how we can really, give them a platform and opportunity to speak on what interfaith should look like in the coming months and years. Um, we are actually doing a small partnership with PBS, and their Visionaries program that is going to drop on PBS stations around the country in mid-July. So we want people to be on the lookout for that, to make sure that they tune in and watch. As soon as we get the details, we'll share them. And we're also hoping that for those who might not be able to watch it, they might be interested in hosting a watch party, whether it's in person or virtually, highlighting some of the work of cooperation circles in the Great Lakes region of Africa and in South India and a couple other places.
Nice.
Mhm.
So we have done some events with you. In fact, just last December 10th, we did an educational event on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China, and educational event on what's going on in Kashmir. And
Mhm.
Victor Kazanjian was a part of the conversation as the executive director of URI, and fortunately he could make it to the East Bay to be a part of an event that was mostly live streamed
Mhm.
around the area. The recording of a lot of that is still online, and we're grateful for that, and his leadership in that. And one other thing I'll just point out is that we've done some work on behalf of Yazidi refugees. And
Mhm.
some of the Bay Area interfaith councils came together and worked with other CCs in the world that were lifting up the plight of the Yazidis who were chased up Mount Sinjar by the so-called IS a few years ago. And if it weren't for our relationship with URI, we wouldn't have been able to do a lot of that work.
Mhm.
And that was just fascinating work with the Yazidi communities here in the United States, in Arizona, and in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Mhm.
We even hosted a gala here in the Bay Area to help raise funds for some of the refugees that were trying to make it out of the refugee camps in Bulgaria and other parts of the Middle East, Syria, Turkey, some of those places.
And I think that speaks so much volumes about why this network is so important to all of us. It's so important to see that there are very real crises affecting so many communities. And if we have an opportunity to connect cooperation circles together who are interested in doing work to create a better world, it'll create those kinds of collaborations that will make such a significant impact that doing anything less would seem like a disservice.
So we each continue to do our piecework. We continue to work in our own areas. And in those areas where we can work together with others around the world, we do so.
Mhm.
And thank you for being our partner, Tahil,
Thank
and representing URI today and helping us understand a little bit more of the global reach of all of that work. And you're always welcome at our elected council meetings, which are on the second Thursdays of every month except July.
Awesome.
And those are on Zoom, so you can make it by Zoom without having
Great.
to commute to Northern California for that. But we're sure appreciative of you and your presence here, and we thank you for your good work, and
Thank you for
look
your
forward
good
to
work,
working
Reverend,
with
and
you
thank
in
you
the
for the space and
years to
time to
come.
share my thoughts and my experience.
Thanks so much. I'll send you the link so you can share it on the URI site as well. Be well.
Sounds good. Be well. Take care.